Hello. As Dan said, I'm Holly. I am an intern here at OCC this year. I am on the student team with Liam and Helen, so you've probably seen me hanging out over this side of the room with the students. But today I'm here to continue our series on the book of Hebrews. So this year, from January, we've been going through the book of Hebrews. We've been looking at images and pictures of who Jesus is and thinking about who we are in light of that. We've considered Jesus as the radiance of God's glory, as the incarnate and the faithful Son, as the Lord of the Sabbath. Before we consider our kind of next aspect or image of Jesus, I wonder if we could just pause for a moment. Take a second just to still ourselves before him, recognizing. Sorry. Good moment to pause. There we go. Okay. So, pause for just a moment. Take a second to still ourselves before him, recognizing that he is here with us now. What a great time of worship we've had, of welcoming the Lord in, of ascending the mountain and entering his presence. I want to continue with that as we go on this morning. So you might want to close your eyes. Just pause. Imagine Jesus. What do you see? Is he shining with the glory of God? Is he broken and bruised on the cross? Is he the roaring lion? Is he the sacrificial lamb? Is he enthroned in heaven, surrounded by angels? Is he drawing close to you in friendship? When you imagine Jesus, what is it you see? The truth is that there are so many ways that we could imagine Jesus, because he is so many things. The lion and the lamb, fully human and fully God, like us and unlike us. If we always picture Jesus one way, even if that way is good and true, we risk limiting him to just one thing when he is so many things. The author of Hebrews invites us to hold these different facets of Jesus together, both giving us more ways to imagine Jesus and to relate to him, but also leading us to marvel and wonder that he is all of these things at once. He is the exact image of God, and he's also the Son of God. He is superior to the angels, but he was also made lower than the angels. In today's passage, the image of Jesus that we get is of our great high priest. So I'd like us to approach this image of Jesus, willing to see and marvel at the fact that he is this, but he's also this. He is like us, but he's also unlike us. Because when we hold these things together, that's when we can marvel and appreciate the mystery and the majesty of who Jesus is and all that he has achieved for us. So, let me pray, and then we'll read. Thank you, Lord Jesus, that there is so much more for us to discover about you. Thank you that you are so many things to us. As we read, Holy Spirit, would you show us Jesus? Amen. So let's read Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14 to 5:10. It should be on the screen behind me, or do you follow along in your own Bibles? Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God. to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and who are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as the sins of the people. And no one takes this honor on himself, but he receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. In the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming high priest, but God said to him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father." And in another place, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. So we're going to broadly follow the order or the chronology of the passage, although the first section, the end of chapter 4, also acts as a kind of conclusion, so I'm going to circle back to that at the end. So the passage from chapter 5, verse 1 onwards can be broken roughly into two sections. Verses 1 to 4 address high priests in general, and verses 5 to 10 go on to describe Jesus specifically in these high priestly terms. So we're going to follow this, talking first briefly about high priests in general, and then we're going to consider how Jesus both fulfills this role and also surpasses it. He is... Okay. I'm going to do a little mic switch. Okay, can you hear me? Brill. Okay, so we're going to consider how Jesus is both a high priest and the great high priest. So, high priests in general. So who were the high priests? The book of Hebrews, the author kind of assumes the audience is pretty familiar with the Old Testament, so familiar with the role of the high priest. So the passage doesn't go into loads of details about who this group of people were and what it was that they did. So we do get a brief description of role in chapter 5, verse 1. The author says, "Every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins." So the high priest is a sort of representative between the people and God. In God's original design, there was no need for such a go-between. In Genesis 1 and 2, we get this beautiful picture of Adam and Eve walking with God in the garden. But then we come to Genesis 3, and humans choose to give in to the temptation to try to elevate themselves apart from this relationship with God. In doing so, they break this union with God. And so we have this distance between God and his people. The priest acts as a kind of go-between. So God still desires this closeness between himself and his people. He establishes the law, the temple, and the priesthood. So the priests are those who bridge the gap between God and the people. As the Hebrews passage tells us, they represent the people to God by offering gifts and sacrifices on their behalf. So animal sacrifice, a bit weird to us, but pretty common practice at the time in the surrounding ancient religions. Unlike in other religions, however, these gifts and sacrifices to God are not meant to manipulate any kind of blessing out of him. As Tom Wright puts it, these are not designed to twist God's arm as though what humans could do could put God in their debt, but to thank God for creation and covenant and to express and embody God's atoning for their sins. So this quote can also help us to understand the dual role of the priest. On the one hand, they offer the people's thanks and praise to God. And on the other, they show God's atoning and forgiveness to the people. They represent the people to God and God to the people. So, as some of you might know, as well as being an intern here at OCC, I'm also a part-time tour guide in the city centre. So I receive groups from kind of all over the world. I take them on little walking tours. We go into some of the colleges and the libraries and generally have a good time. It's good fun. So when I go into a college or a library, I am the representative of that tour group to the university. I go in, I buy their tickets, tell them how many people, and I get us access to the college. On the other hand, I represent the university to the tour group. So when they sign up for a tour, they sign up for a walking tour with an Oxford alumni guide. So for better or worse, I am the one who represents the university to them. So they come to me with all their questions, lots of which I cannot answer. I get some weird ones sometimes. But they look to me to show them what the university is like. So to the tour group, I represent the university. To the university, I represent the tour group. In a similar way, the priest is the one who represents God to the people and the people to God. So I guess you could say I'm a tour guide / priest. I don't know. No, maybe not. So Aaron. Aaron is the first in the long line of Aaronic high priests in the Old Testament. So he is the one who first offers these sacrifices to God on behalf of the people, and also represents God to the people. So it's through Aaron that God blesses his people with this well-known blessing from the book of Numbers. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. So the role of the high priest was a mediator to represent the people to God and God to the people. Okay, so after briefly mentioning the role of the high priest, the Hebrews passage focuses in on 2 qualifications required to be a high priest. So firstly, verses 2 and 3 tell us that he is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weaknesses. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. So the first qualification of the high priest is that he is able to empathize with those he represents. The high priests were very much human and subject to human weakness. So let's go back to Aaron briefly. Aaron, as we've mentioned, was appointed high priest by God. And he is pretty clearly someone who is subject to human weakness. So in Exodus 32, Moses is up on a mountain communing with God. And he is receiving the 10 commandments and other laws from God for the people. One of these commandments that Moses is receiving reads, "You shall not make an image in the form of anything on heaven above or on the earth below or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them." So we've got Moses at the top of the mountain. Meanwhile, Aaron is at the bottom of the mountain, collecting up the jewelry and the gold of all the people so that he can make them a golden calf to worship. So in other words, Moses is getting this commandment up here, and Aaron is breaking this commandment down here. So bit of a rocky start for Aaron, clearly someone who is subject to human weakness. Aaron's sons, who were also appointed high priests, were no better. So first day on the job, they broke the rules that God had given them with pretty disastrous consequences. So Leviticus 10 reads, "They offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, contrary to his command. So fire came out of the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord." So God's presence was not something to be taken lightly. Because of the holiness of God and the sin of the people, there were all of these rules and requirements in order for anyone to enter the holiest place, the place where God dwelled. And Aaron's sons immediately fall short of this. They, like their father before them, are subject to human weakness. So the first qualification of the high priest is that they are able to empathize with the people that they represent. In other words, they're human, subject to human weakness, and so can understand the people in their weaknesses. The second qualification that the Hebrews passage gives us comes in verse 4, which reads, "And no one takes this honor on himself, but he receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was."
So the second qualification is that the high priest is appointed by God. If we go back to Exodus, we see that despite Aaron's many failures, he and his sons are appointed by God to serve as priests. In Exodus 28, God says to Moses, "Have Aaron, your brother, brought to you from among the Israelites, along with his sons, so that they may serve me as priests." So what is important here is what is important here is that the high priest does not appoint himself, but is rather appointed by God. So the high priests, these representatives or mediators between humanity and God, are, one, able to empathize with those they represent, and two, are appointed by God. So having laid out these qualifications for priests in general, the Hebrews author then applies them to Jesus specifically. He kind of flips them around or inverts them. So firstly, in verse 5, we read that in the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming high priest. So we're going to come back to the fact that Jesus was appointed. For now, what is important is this comparison in the same way. In the same way as the other high priests, Jesus did not take the role upon himself, but was appointed by God. So first qualification, big tick. What about our other qualification? So high priest must be able to empathize with those he represents. The passage is quite clear in emphasizing that Jesus does fulfill this qualification because he was and is human. It draws out two key experiences of Jesus that show him to be human. Firstly, he was tempted as we are tempted. And secondly, he felt as we feel. Hello? And we're back. If we jump back briefly to the end of chapter 4, we'll see the emphasis on Jesus' temptation. So 4 verse 15 reads, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are." So the clearest instance that we have of Jesus being tempted happens just before his public ministry begins. Just after he is baptized, he is led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where he fasts and prays for 40 days and 40 nights. And at the end of this time, the devil comes to him and tempts him. So we can find this account in Matthew chapter 4, and it's also in Mark and Luke. There are echoes in this scene of both the tempting of Adam and Eve in the garden, and also the tempting of the Israelites in the wilderness. So like in the Garden of Eden, the devil tries to twist the truth of who Jesus is and what his vocation was. So in this moment, Jesus is preparing to begin his public ministry, one in which he will be hurt and betrayed, he will suffer, and ultimately he will die. It's in this moment that the enemy tries to lure him with an easier way. He says, "If you're the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." In other words, why should you be hungry? He says, "If you're the Son of God, throw yourself down." In other words, make a spectacle of yourselves. Show them how powerful you are. He says, "If you're the Son of God," he says, "all this I will give you if you will bow down and worship me." In other words, there's an easier way, Jesus. It would be so much quicker and easier if you just worshipped me. Jesus is one who is tempted in every way, just as we are. So we're going to come back to the wilderness shortly, but for now we're going to jump forward a little bit to the Garden of Gethsemane. This is a garden that has become symbolic of the deeply felt emotional suffering of Jesus. Hebrews 5 verse 7 says, "During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death." Others have noted here the echoes of the Garden of Gethsemane. So at the start of Jesus' ministry, he is tempted in the wilderness. Here we come to the end, just before he goes to the cross, and we find him in a garden. knowing what's about to happen, Jesus is in agony. In Matthew 26, verse 38, Jesus tells his friends, "My soul is consumed with sorrow to the point of death." He then leaves his friends to watch and pray while he goes to cry out to God. Verse 39 tells us, he fell face down and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." He repeats this prayer 3 times. The same story is told in the Gospel of Luke, who writes that in his anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. So not only did Jesus experience the worst imaginable physical pain as he hung on the cross, he knew emotional anguish. He knew what it was to feel and experience sorrow and grief. He knew the emotional and the physical toll of facing death and darkness head on. So I don't know how you picture Jesus, but for me, it was a pretty significant revelation that actually he feels the human emotions that I feel. Somehow I'd managed to read these accounts of Jesus' life and come to the subconscious conclusion that he was somehow floating through life above the realm of human emotion, less affected and less moved by the things that affected and moved the people around him. I thought, of course, life was easier for him. He's God. But this kind of floaty Zen Jesus is not the Jesus we see in the Gospels. At some point for me, it clicked that Jesus didn't just experience what it was to be human physically, but also emotionally, mentally, spiritually. I started to go back to the Gospels and wonder how on earth I'd managed to come to this conclusion that Jesus somehow floated above the realm of human emotion. When his friend dies, Jesus weeps. In response to the suffering, ostracized leper and the desperate crowds, Jesus is moved with compassion. The word for compassion in the original language here, I'm not going to try and pronounce it, comes from the word for inward parts. I think we probably all know this gut-wrenching physical and emotional response to pain and suffering. And Jesus knew it too. He is moved by pain and suffering in the deepest parts of his being. So if you're going through difficult times at the moment, if you're in pain or feeling broken, there's a reminder here that Jesus is moved by you. He feels your pain and your suffering in the deepest parts of his being. So let's go back to Gethsemane. Jesus is in anguish. He knows what it means to face death and darkness as a human. He is able to empathize with those he represents in their suffering and their grief and their sorrow because he knows what all those things feel like. I wonder if we could take another moment here just to pause. Again, you may want to close your eyes. Imagine Jesus. Maybe, like me, you've imagined him floating through life, less affected by human emotion. See him now in the garden. Sweat falling from him, heavy like blood. Falling face down in the grass and crying out to his Father, "Let this cup pass from me." See him now, fully human. But this is not the end of the story. As we've seen, Jesus meets these qualifications for a high priest. He was appointed by God, and he was able to empathize with the people that he represents, having been suffered and tempted as a human. But Jesus is not just a high priest, the next in a long line of high priests. He is the great high priest, our great high priest. He doesn't just meet the qualifications, he surpasses them. He is able to empathize with those he represents, being fully human, but he also did what no other human could do. Yes, he was appointed by God, but he was appointed to a different, greater order of priesthood. So let's go back to Hebrews 4:15. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Jesus was tempted in every way, as we've seen, but he did not sin. Let's go back to the wilderness. The devil comes at Jesus with everything that made the others before him stumble and fall. Take this easier path. Seize power for yourself. Worship me. In the face of these temptations, all others failed. Adam and Eve eat the fruit. The Israelites turn away from God again and again. Aaron makes the golden calf, but Jesus does not fail. He was tempted in every way, just as they are, just as we are, yet he did not sin. In response to the devil's temptations, Jesus replies, "It is written." And he clings to God by clinging to his word, sending the devil away with the words, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." He refuses to obey and submit to the devil, choosing instead to obey and submit to God. So now let's go back to Gethsemane, where Jesus felt the depths of human emotion. We left Jesus falling face down before God and crying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." But the prayer doesn't end there. "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." In the face of the deepest anguish, when Jesus is tempted to turn away again from the will of the Father, to choose this easier way, he prays, "Not my will, but your will." The author of Hebrews writes that during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Where all others gave in and submitted to sin and the devil, Jesus submitted himself to God. He was heard not because he was God, but because of his reverent submission to God. The next verses of the Hebrews passage say, "Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him." Now, this might seem like a strange way to describe Jesus. Was he not always perfect? The author of Hebrews has already clarified that Jesus lived a life completely free of sin. So we're not talking here about a move from imperfection to perfection. The focus here is not on moral perfection, but on Jesus being made perfect for a particular role. It was through being tempted and suffering as a human, as one like us, that Jesus was qualified for the role of high priest. And it was through facing temptation and emotional turmoil in complete submission to God and completely free of sin that he was qualified to be our great high priest. What does it mean for Jesus not just to be a high priest, but to be our great high priest? So here's where we come back to our second priestly qualification that Jesus surpasses. He was appointed by God to a different and greater order of priesthood. Our passage ends with a reference to what this greater order might look like. It says, "He was designated by God to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek." Now, the mysterious Melchizedek is also mentioned a little bit earlier in the passage as well, in verses 5 and 6. which read, "In the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming high priest, but God said to him, 'You are my son. Today I have become your father.' And he says in another place, 'You are a high priest in the order of Melchizedek.'" So the author here brings together two quotes, one from Psalm 2 and one from Psalm 110. And in drawing these two verses together, the author brings together two identities of Jesus, son and priest. So the title Son of God in the Old Testament spoke to, among other things, a royal identity. So actually, in bringing these two verses together, he's also bringing together the images of priest and king. The author also casually name drops here Melchizedek, who happened to be also both priest and king. So you're going to have to wait a little bit to find out about Melchizedek. He comes up a bit later in Hebrews, and I'm going to leave Liam to deal with him in a couple of weeks' time. Good luck, Liam. So this is really just to flag an important theme here of the priest-king. We're not ignoring it. We're just going to come back to it later. For now, the key thing I want us to focus on is that Jesus is appointed by God to a different, greater order of priesthood. This is a priesthood that his suffering and submission to God qualified him for. In the quote from Psalm 110, God says to him, "You are a priest forever." So this is an eternal priesthood. Where the priests before him were limited to a particular people and a particular historical moment, the priesthood of Jesus is eternal, and it's now. Where the priests before him had to offer repeated sacrifice for their own sins and the sins of the people, the perfect sacrifice of Jesus was once and for all. What the priests before him could perform in a token and symbolic way, Jesus did in reality. Where the priests before him had only limited and temporary access to God, Jesus opened up permanent, eternal access to God. So when we look at Jesus, our great high priest, we're not just looking back at another in a long line of imperfect, temporary mediators between humans and God. We're looking to the one who right now, in this moment, sits with God, praying for us, feeling with us, and inviting us into his presence. Because Jesus humbled himself and became like us, one who is tempted as we are tempted, who feel as we feel, and because he did what no other human can do, submitting to God in everything, because he is like us, but also because he is unlike us, because both of these things are true. He has become the ultimate high priest, opening up this new and living way for us to enter into the presence of God. So, as I said we're going to circle back now to the end of chapter 4. So I invite you just to listen as I read. "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." So what does it mean for us that Jesus is great high priest? It means that we can boldly approach the throne of God, knowing that we will receive grace and mercy. It means that we can hold firmly to the faith that we profess because Jesus has done everything that was necessary for us to open up this kind of access. It means that we have one in heaven who knows what it is to be human, who deeply understands us and sympathizes with us, who feels with us. So, with our temptation and suffering, our grief and our joy, confusion, overwhelm, fear, let's approach God's throne of grace again now. And remember that this is the reality we get to live in today, tomorrow, this week, for the rest of our lives, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. So I'm going to invite the band back up, and if the prayer team want to come up too, that would be great. So I think there's a reminder for some of us this morning that we have a God who knows what it is to be human, to feel as we feel. We can come to him with all our pain and sin and hurt, knowing that we will find grace and kindness and real deep understanding at the throne of God. So I'd like to invite us to boldly approach the throne again this morning. Maybe you're here this morning and you wouldn't call yourself a follower of Jesus. This whole thing is kind of new to you. As an invitation to take a step towards Jesus, the great high priest, this morning, the one who knows you and feels with you. So as we worship, do come forward. The prayer team would love to pray with you. And it may be that you are going through a difficult time at the moment. Again, do come forward as we start singing, and the prayer team would love to pray with you. Let's not let this moment just pass us by. Let's approach our high priest again with confidence now and worship him.